In a skyscraper built of glass and power, a black janitor everyone ignored did something no billionaire could. He reached a child no one could touch, and changed 3 lives forever. Morning broke over Manhattan like liquid gold spilling between towers of glass and steel. Inside the 70-story headquarters of Pierce Global Dynamics, light bounced off polished marble, off designer shoes, off ambition itself. People moved fast, voices sharp with purpose. No one noticed the black man pushing a janitor's cart across the lobby floor. His name was Jordan Blackwell. 38 years old. Shoulders slightly bent from years of work that never left a name on the door. He moved quietly, head bowed, mop gliding across the marble as if he were apologizing just for being there. The building smelled of perfume, coffee, and money, everything that once belonged to another life. A group of executives strode past, suits pressed, laughter echoing off the walls. One of them clipped the edge of Jordan's bucket with his shoe, spilling water across the floor. "Here, man," the man said, tossing a folded bill onto the puddle. "Clean it faster." Jordan looked at the bill for a moment, then knelt to pick it up. Not in anger. Not in shame. Just the quiet acceptance of someone who had seen worse kinds of humiliation. He wiped the floor until the reflection returned, his reflection, caught in the mirrored wall of the lobby. For a second, he saw a stranger looking back at him, a man erased, reduced to silence in a world that measured worth by the shine of its surfaces. Behind that glass, million-dollar deals were made, lives rewritten, names immortalized. And yet his own name had become invisible, spoken only on pay stubs and cleaning rosters. He stood there a heartbeat longer than he should have, studying that faint ghost in the mirror, then straightened, smoothed his uniform, and kept walking. The rhythm of the mop against tile was the only sound that belonged to him. It had a certain peace to it, like prayer. Outside, cabs blared, horns merged into a city's pulse that never stopped. Inside, time moved differently, measured not by minutes but by how long you could stay unnoticed. A receptionist brushed past him without eye contact, the scent of expensive perfume trailing behind. Somewhere on the upper floors, laughter erupted from a conference room. Somewhere else, a coffee order was shouted down the hall. Jordan kept moving. He didn't belong to that world, and maybe that was why he saw it so clearly, the loneliness hidden behind success, the way even the powerful looked tired beneath their perfect suits. As he reached the end of the lobby, he gathered his supplies, checked the gleam on the last stretch of floor, and paused. It was faint at first, a sound so small it might have been imagined, the soft cry of a child, distant, somewhere above the hum of the elevators. He froze, listening. The sound came again, a single sob, thin and trembling, from the higher floors. For a moment he stood perfectly still, the mop handle gripped in his hands. Something deep inside him shifted, an ache he had spent years burying rising to the surface. Then, as quickly as it had come, he forced himself to breathe, to let it go. He was just the janitor. Not his place. Not his world. He pushed the cart forward, wheels squeaking softly against the marble. Behind him, the echo of that small cry lingered in the air like a memory refusing to fade. No one in that tower of glass could have known that the man cleaning their floors had once stood before classrooms full of children, teaching them how to dream. And none of them could have imagined that the sound of a little girl crying would soon reopen a wound he thought was long healed. 70 floors above the city, sunlight spilled through glass walls that framed the Manhattan skyline like a painting. The air in the executive boardroom was still, too clean, too perfect, like everything in Eleanor Pierce's world. She sat at the end of a long glass table, a woman built from discipline and precision. At 41, she had mastered everything from mergers to ministers, from billion-dollar negotiations to crises that would crush most people. And yet this morning, her hands trembled. On the screen before her glowed the 9th psychological report about her daughter, Isabel Pierce, age 7. Subject rejects all contact. Severe trauma. Hospitalization recommended. Eleanor read it 3 times, as if repetition could make it less unbearable. It didn't. She shut the laptop quietly, the sound small and final. For a moment she stared at her reflection in the glass, a woman who could bend markets but not fate. A knock on the door broke the silence. Her assistant peeked in, voice cautious. "Mrs. Pierce, the board meeting starts in 20. Delay it," Eleanor said softly. "Yes, ma'am." When the door closed, she rose, heels clicking against the floor like a metronome counting down to something she didn't yet understand. She walked down the corridor to the private room built just for Isabel, a child's paradise designed by experts. Warm lights, pastel walls, shelves of designer toys, a digital piano, even hidden cameras to ensure her safety. But now the room felt cold, haunted by quiet. Isabel sat in the far corner, knees drawn to her chest, clutching a doll in one arm. The doll's hair was tangled, its face faded from being held too tight for too long. Eleanor knelt carefully, her voice soft, measured, as if speaking too loudly might make her daughter vanish. "Honey, we'll see a new doctor today. She's very kind. You might." The words stopped as Isabel's head snapped up, eyes burning through tears. "I don't want doctors," she screamed. "I want Daddy back." The doll flew from her hands and hit the wall with a sharp crack. The sound echoed through the room like glass breaking. Eleanor froze. Her fingers twitched, as if reaching for something invisible. She had faced angry shareholders, hostile governments, even the press waiting for her downfall, but nothing felt like this. Her daughter's voice sliced through every layer of control she'd ever built. Isabel buried her face in her knees again, shaking. Eleanor reached out but stopped halfway, her hand hovering in the air, useless. She whispered her name, once, then twice, and when no answer came, her hand fell to her side. The cameras in the corners kept recording, capturing the moment the most powerful woman in the building realized she didn't know how to hold her own child. Minutes passed. Then hours. She sat on the floor, watching Isabel fall asleep against the wall, still clutching the air where her doll had been. Eleanor's eyes drifted across the room, the toys, the walls, the technology meant to simulate comfort. All of it looked meaningless now, sterile. Slowly she stood, stepped outside, and closed the door behind her as quietly as she could. In the hallway, she pressed her back against the wall and let out a long, shaking breath. Her chest tightened, a dull ache spreading through her ribs. The corridor lights hummed faintly above her, indifferent. She had built a life that obeyed her, stock prices, contracts, employees, but her daughter's pain was a storm no logic could tame. Eleanor made it back to her office and sank into her chair. The skyline glittered before her, thousands of windows burning gold in the afternoon sun. Somewhere below, taxis crawled like tiny sparks of life. She opened her drawer and took out a framed photo, 3 faces smiling. Richard, her husband, strong and steady. Isabel between them, beaming, missing a front tooth. Herself, laughing, back when laughter came easily. 3 months ago, a plane crash ended that world. "You always said you could fix anything," she whispered to the photo. "So why can't I fix her?" Her voice cracked on the last word. For the first time in 3 months, tears found their way down her cheeks, slow and silent. She covered her face with both hands and let herself break. The city outside blurred behind her tears, its lights flickering like distant ghosts. When she finally lifted her head, her gaze drifted toward the massive window that overlooked the lobby far below. Through the gleam of glass and sunlight, she noticed movement, a figure pushing a mop across the marble floor. The janitor. His uniform plain, his posture humble, his face calm. For a reason she couldn't name, she watched him longer than she should have. In a tower filled with brilliance and noise, he moved with quiet grace, untouched by chaos. And for the briefest second, Eleanor Pierce, the woman who had everything, wondered why the only calm she'd seen all day came from a man the world didn't even see. The light in the small apartment flickered, weak and yellow against the gray dawn creeping through the blinds. It was 5 a.m. in Queens, the hour when the city still held its breath between night and noise. Jordan Blackwell sat at a small wooden table, elbows resting beside a framed photograph of a little boy with curly hair and a gap-toothed smile. Ethan. His son. The photo was worn around the edges, the glass faintly cracked, as if time itself had pressed too hard against it. Jordan stared at it for a long time, eyes hollow but gentle, his thumb tracing the outline of the boy's smile. "Good morning, champ," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. In his mind, the room filled with color again, alive with laughter and Lego bricks scattered across the floor. "Dad, look," Ethan's voice rang out, high and bright. "I'll build a castle for you." Jordan smiled in the memory. "A castle, huh?" "Yeah. Big enough for both of us. You'll live in the tall tower, and I'll guard the gate." He had laughed then, that deep, quiet laugh fathers save for moments they want to remember forever. "You're my hero already, kiddo." The memory glowed for a heartbeat, then broke apart like glass. The sound of an old clock ticked in the background, pulling him back into the silence. He closed his eyes, and another sound took over, the one he could never forget. The ringing phone. The voice on the other end, shaking. "Mr. Blackwell, there's been an accident." He remembered the way the world tilted under him, how he ran out of his classroom without grabbing his coat, how the sky looked too bright as he raced to the hospital. He remembered the doctor's eyes before the words even came. "I'm sorry." That was all it took to end a lifetime. Sarah, his wife, survived. But she never really came back. For weeks, she sat by the window, staring at the street below, saying nothing. Then one morning, Jordan found her on the floor beside the bed, clutching Ethan's toy car. "It's my fault," she whispered again and again. "I wasn't paying attention. I should have died instead." He held her tight, whispering that it wasn't her fault, that love forgives, that they still had each other. But grief has a way of hollowing people out from the inside. One evening, he came home to find the apartment quiet. Too quiet. On the kitchen table lay a folded letter written in her soft, slanted handwriting. "I see his face every day, and it kills me. I'm not as strong as you. I love you, Jordan. I'm sorry." She never came back. No one ever saw her again. Jordan searched hospitals, shelters, every corner of the city until the trail disappeared into silence. After that, he stopped looking. He couldn't bear to see the pity in other people's eyes anymore. He quit teaching. The classroom that once felt like a second home now felt like a wound. Every child's laugh, every innocent question, each one was a reminder of what he had lost. So he sold the house, packed what was left into 2 boxes, and moved to this small apartment in Queens. For years, he drifted from one job to another, waiter, delivery driver, mover, whatever kept the lights on and the rent paid. Each night, he sat at the same table under the same weak light, sewing little toys out of old fabric and scraps of wood. A teddy bear from an old sweater. A rabbit from torn felt. A small car carved from popsicle sticks. His hands moved slowly, carefully, as if the act itself kept something alive inside him. Maybe it did. "Maybe it's easier," he once whispered to the empty room, "to clean other people's mess than to face your own." The words hung there for a long time, then disappeared into the hum of the refrigerator. He picked up a faded shirt from the back of the chair, his favorite from years ago, and cut a square from it. By midnight, he had sewn a tiny teddy bear, uneven and clumsy, one ear larger than the other. He smiled faintly, exhaustion softening the edges of his pain. "For you, Ethan," he said, setting it beside the photo. The city outside had begun to wake, horns echoing through the streets, footsteps on the sidewalks below. Jordan turned off the light and sat in the dark for a moment longer, listening to the quiet. When he opened his eyes again, a thin beam of sunrise cut across the table, landing on a folded newspaper left by the door. The front page headlines screamed about markets, politics, and power, none of it mattered. But at the bottom corner, an ad caught his eye. Pierce Global Dynamics seeks night shift janitor. Immediate start. Background check required. He stared at it, unsure why the word seemed to pull at him. Maybe it was the idea of a place where no one looked at him, where silence could finally be a kind of safety. He tore the ad out carefully, folded it into his wallet, and whispered to the empty room, "Guess it's time to start over." He didn't know that the job he chose out of exhaustion would soon become the beginning of everything he thought he'd lost. The sun was sinking behind Manhattan, turning the 30th-floor hallway of Pierce Global Dynamics into a corridor of gold and quiet. The offices were empty now, the laughter and footsteps of the day replaced by the hush that came when ambition went home to rest. Jordan Blackwell moved slowly along the marble floor, mop in hand, his reflection sliding beneath him in the polished stone. The faint hum of air conditioning was the only sound. Then he heard it, a sound so soft it barely belonged to the world. A muffled sob, small, broken, hiding somewhere behind the far marble column at the end of the hall. He froze, his heartbeat suddenly louder than the city outside. For a moment he thought he'd imagined it. Then it came again, trembling, fragile, like something lost and afraid to be found. Jordan hesitated. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in this part of the building after hours. Janitors didn't wander off schedule, and they certainly didn't go near the Pierce family's private offices. But that sound, it didn't belong to money or power. It belonged to pain. He set the mop aside and walked toward it, each step careful, respectful, as if approaching a wounded bird. Behind the column, half hidden in shadow, sat a little girl. Isabel Pierce. Her knees were pulled tight to her chest, her face buried in her arms, small shoulders shaking. The afternoon light caught the edge of her hair, making a faint halo against the cold stone. Jordan stopped a few feet away, unsure what to do. She sensed him there and flinched. "Go away." Her voice cracked, raw from crying. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply knelt down slowly until his knees touched the floor, keeping a distance that felt safe, 3 steps between them, no closer. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then he reached into his pocket. From it, he pulled a small teddy bear, brown, clumsily stitched, one ear larger than the other. The thread was uneven, but the bear looked alive in a way only something made with love could. Jordan placed it gently on the floor halfway between them. No words. No gesture to force her hand. He leaned back slightly, resting on his heels, and waited. Time seemed to stretch, suspended in the quiet hum of the hallway. Isabel's sobs grew softer, curiosity mixing with confusion. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her eyes were red, lashes wet and stuck together. She looked at the bear, then at the man sitting silently before her. He didn't smile. He didn't reach out. He just nodded once, calm and patient, his gaze kind but steady. The girl blinked, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and hesitated. Then she reached out, small fingers trembling, and touched the bear's fur. It was soft, warm, and carried the faint scent of something real, something human. She pulled it into her arms and held it tightly, pressing her face into it as if it might disappear. The sound that followed was not silence, but peace. The sobbing stopped. For the first time in months, the world around her was still. Jordan sat with her for a little while longer, breathing slowly, giving her space to breathe too. When he felt her calm settle, he rose quietly, picked up his mop, and turned away. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Behind him, the little girl sat under the fading light, hugging the crooked teddy bear as if it were the only thing keeping her heart from falling apart. Up on the 70th floor, in an office made of glass and power, Eleanor Pierce stared at a security feed glowing on her screen. The image was grainy but clear, a janitor in a blue uniform kneeling beside her daughter, saying nothing, doing nothing, except placing a small bear between them. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled, not with confusion but something deeper, astonishment, grief, relief all tangled together. On the screen, her daughter stopped crying. No doctor had managed that. No therapy, no medicine. Just silence, and a man no one ever noticed. A single tear slid down Eleanor's cheek as she whispered to herself, how did he do that, without saying a word? The next afternoon, the lobby cafe at Pierce Global was nearly empty. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, turning the marble floor into sheets of soft gold. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, the faint hum of conversation mixing with the steady rhythm of the espresso machine. Jordan Blackwell was wiping tables near the corner when a small shadow appeared in his peripheral vision. He turned, and there she was. Isabel Pierce. For the first time in 3 months, the little girl had come downstairs on her own. Her hair was loosely tied, her hoodie slightly too big, sleeves covering her hands. In her arms, the small teddy bear. She walked slowly, her steps uncertain, but her eyes, tired, careful, were focused on him. Jordan froze, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. She stopped a few feet away and lowered herself onto the floor, crossing her legs. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him, waiting, as if she had something to ask but didn't know how. Jordan knelt down to her level, leaving the same respectful distance as before. The cafe staff paused mid-motion, curious. A janitor and the CEO's daughter, it wasn't something you saw every day. Jordan reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small plastic bottle cap. He set it gently between them. Do you want to hear a story? He asked softly. Isabel nodded, barely. He rolled the cap across the floor, letting it spin once before catching it. Once upon a time, everyone threw this little cap away, he began. They said it was useless, that it had no value. Isabel's brows furrowed slightly. But it wasn't sad, Jordan continued. Because it knew a secret. Its worth isn't about what others see. It's about how it sees itself. The girl tilted her head, staring at the tiny cap as if it were suddenly something magical. Her voice, when it came, was fragile and hesitant. Are you sad too? The question hung in the air between them. Jordan blinked. No one had asked him that in years. He looked at her, the smallest smile touching his face. I used to be. Isabel looked down at her bear, pressing it closer to her chest. I lost my dad, she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. Jordan's heart tightened. He didn't look away. I lost my son, he said quietly. The words came like a breath, soft but certain. She looked up, eyes glistening. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter and the slow ticking of the wall clock. Two souls, one small and broken, one older but just as scarred, sat together in a silence that felt like understanding. No therapy room. No specialists. Just the simplicity of presence. Jordan picked up the cap again, spinning it once more. You see, he said, sometimes things that seem useless can still hold stories. Maybe even help someone smile again. Isabel didn't answer, but a faint smile flickered at the corner of her mouth. The kind that comes when grief loosens its grip for the first time. She turned the teddy bear over in her hands, tracing the crooked stitches on its arm. Did you make this? Jordan nodded. Yes. It's not perfect, she said honestly. Jordan chuckled softly. Neither am I. That earned a small giggle from her, a sound so light it barely touched the air, yet it filled the whole room. He felt something in his chest ease for the first time in years. The kind of peace that didn't erase pain but made it bearable. Minutes passed. She stayed seated on the floor, playing with the cap, talking little, listening more. When it was time for him to leave, she simply looked up and said, "Can I see you again tomorrow?" Jordan hesitated, then nodded once. "If you want." She smiled. "I want." He picked up his cleaning cart, glanced back only once. The girl was still sitting there, sunlight glinting in her hair, the teddy bear resting on her lap. Upstairs, cameras captured it all. Down the hall, in a break room, an employee with too much curiosity replayed the footage on the internal feed, eyebrows raised. "The janitor is talking to the CEO's daughter," he muttered, pulling out his phone. Within an hour, the clip spread across the building's internal network, subtitled, commented, whispered about. By evening, everyone at Pierce Global had seen it. Some called it strange. Others called it beautiful. But no one could deny it. The silent man and the broken child had found each other, and something in that simple, wordless exchange had changed everything. The air inside the boardroom felt too still, too sharp, like the moment before a storm. Glass walls reflected the skyline of Manhattan, but inside, the temperature had dropped several degrees. 12 men and women sat around the table, eyes locked on Eleanor Pierce. The headline glowing on the big screen behind her read in bold letters, "Billionaire CEO's strange decision, Pierce hires janitor to care for daughter." Silence lingered before one voice broke through. "Eleanor," said Victoria Chen, the senior board member, tone clipped and precise, "you hired a janitor to treat your child. Do you understand what this looks like?" Eleanor didn't flinch. "Yes," she replied, calm but firm. "It looks like a mother trying to save her daughter." Another director leaned forward, his tie glinting in the light. "With all due respect, this isn't just about optics. The press is tearing you apart. Investors are calling. They're questioning your stability, your judgment. You can't risk this company over sentiment." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Sentiment," she repeated softly. "For 3 months my daughter didn't speak. She didn't smile. Every doctor failed. Every therapist gave up. And yet a man with no title, no degree, made her smile again. If that's sentiment, then maybe the world could use more of it." The room erupted in low murmurs. Someone muttered about liability, another about public image. Victoria raised a hand. "Eleanor, listen to yourself. You're letting grief cloud your decisions." Eleanor's voice cut through the noise, quiet but sharp as glass. "Grief taught me to see clearly. Logic can't heal a child's heart. Compassion can." The words hung in the air, final and unanswerable. Across the table, Victoria sighed and looked away. "You'll have to face the consequences," she said. "Let them come," Eleanor answered, standing. "My daughter is more important than your headlines." By evening, those headlines had multiplied. News tickers flashed her face beside Jordan's, reporters calling it reckless, dangerous, even delusional. The story flooded social media, "A billionaire trusts a janitor more than the system." And while the city debated, Jordan sat on the cafe floor with Isabel, telling her another story. The bear rested on her lap, and she was smiling, a small, cautious smile, but real. He held up a napkin folded into the shape of a bird. "Once upon a time, there was a paper bird who was afraid to fly," he said. "Every time it tried, it fell. But one day it realized, maybe falling isn't failure. Maybe it's learning how to land." Isabel giggled. "That's silly." "Maybe," he said, smiling. "But sometimes silly helps." She laughed again, soft and genuine. Then a shadow fell across the light. 2 uniformed police officers stood by the counter, their voices low but firm. "Sir," one said, stepping forward, "you need to come with us." The cafe froze. Chairs creaked. The barista stopped mid-motion. Jordan blinked, confused. "For what?" "Just some questions," the officer replied. "We've had a complaint." Isabel's smile vanished. "No," she whispered, clutching Jordan's hand. "No." He knelt quickly, his voice gentle. "It's okay, sweetheart. They just want to talk." But the girl's breathing quickened. "They'll take you away," she cried. "Just like they took Daddy." The words sliced through the cafe like lightning. People stared. The officers hesitated. Jordan swallowed hard, his own heart cracking open. No one's taking me, okay? I promise. But she was already sobbing, clutching his sleeve so tightly it hurt. Don't let them take you, Uncle Jordan. The officers shifted uneasily. One reached forward, and then another voice rang out, clear and commanding. That's enough. Eleanor Pierce stood in the doorway, her heels striking the tile like gunfire. The room fell silent. Mrs. Pierce, one officer started, we're following up on a report, then follow up with me, she interrupted, stepping between them and Jordan. He works for me. If you have questions, you'll go through our legal department. Ma'am, without a court order, she said, voice cold, you're done here. The officers exchanged a look, then backed off slowly. We'll be in touch. You do that, Eleanor replied. When they were gone, Isabel still clung to Jordan, shaking. Eleanor knelt, smoothing her daughter's hair, whispering softly until the girl's breathing slowed. The cafe watched in silence, no one daring to move. That night, long after the lights went out, Jordan sat in his small apartment, a duffel bag half-packed on the floor. The teddy bear lay beside it, staring up at him with button eyes. He ran a hand over his face. She's better off without me, he muttered. All I did was make things harder. A knock came at the door. When he opened it, Eleanor stood there, still in her suit, eyes tired but steady. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited. You're leaving, she said quietly. It's for the best, he answered. The press, the board, the police, they'll come for you next. Let them, she said. They see a janitor. She sees a father. And that's all that matters. Jordan looked away. You don't understand. I do, she said softly. You lost your boy, didn't you? He froze. How? I know everything, Eleanor said. I had to. You think I'd let anyone near my daughter without knowing who they are? She stepped closer, her voice trembling but kind. You understand her because you've lived her pain. That's why she trusts you. And that's why I do too. Jordan's throat tightened. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city lights flickered through the window, painting the room in gold and shadow. Then Eleanor said quietly, don't walk away now. Not when she finally found someone who listens. He sat down, the weight of years pressing against his chest. She stood beside him, silent. For the first time, their grief didn't feel like something to hide. It felt shared. Eleanor's voice broke the quiet one last time. You helped her remember love, she said. Maybe she's helping you do the same. Jordan looked up at her, eyes glistening. Maybe, he said. And when she left, he stayed at the window for a long time, the city glowing beneath him. Somewhere inside that light, a little girl was sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. A year had passed, and the marble lobby of Pierce Global no longer felt cold. Where glass once echoed with silence, sunlight now poured through the high windows in warm, golden streams. The air smelled of cocoa and crayons instead of disinfectant and power. The sign above the entrance read Ethan's Light. Beneath it, children laughed. Some were shy, some loud, some quiet like Isabel once was, but all of them were here because they had lost something, and were learning that loss didn't mean the end of love. Jordan Blackwell sat cross-legged on a soft rug in the center of the room, 5 children gathered around him. In his hands, he held a small, hand-carved star cut from pale wood. Isabel sat nearby, helping a new girl pour hot chocolate into paper cups, careful not to spill. She was taller now, her eyes brighter, her laughter easy. A year ago she hadn't spoken. Now her voice carried warmth that filled every corner of the room. Jordan smiled at her before turning back to the children. Once, he said, holding up the wooden star, there was a little star that wasn't the brightest. In fact, most nights, no one even noticed it shining. The big stars laughed at it, and the moon ignored it. The children leaned closer, listening. But one night, Jordan continued, a lost child wandered into a dark forest. The path was gone, and the sky was covered in clouds. The child was scared, until a small flicker appeared above the trees. It wasn't much, just a faint light. But it was enough to see by. And that tiny star guided the child home. He paused, letting the silence breathe. So you see, he said softly, you don't have to be the brightest star. You just have to shine for someone who needs it. For a moment, no one moved. Then small hands began to clap, and the sound grew into gentle applause that echoed through the room. Jordan smiled, lowering the star. All right, he said, that's enough storytelling for one day. Go play. The world outside will still need you when you're ready. The children scattered, their laughter like wind chimes in the light. Isabel finished pouring the last cup of cocoa and walked over to him. You tell that story like you've lived it, she teased softly. Jordan chuckled. Maybe I have. In the back of the room, Eleanor stood watching, her arms crossed, tears quietly slipping down her face. Her daughter was alive again, not just breathing, but living. And the man who once swept her floors was now teaching her child how to hope. When the children began to leave, hugging Isabel goodbye, Jordan helped stack the chairs and fold the blankets. Isabel tugged on his sleeve. Wait, she said. She ran to her backpack and returned with a folded sheet of paper. I made something. Jordan unfolded it carefully. The drawing was clumsy, colorful, and perfect. 4 figures stood together under a yellow sun, a woman, a little girl, a man with gray at his temples, and beside him, a smaller boy holding his hand. She had written their names in uneven letters, Mom. Me. Uncle Jordan. Ethan. He stared at the picture, unable to speak. Isabel smiled up at him. Now Ethan won't be lonely anymore, she said. The words broke something open inside him, and for the first time in years, the tears that came didn't hurt. They felt clean. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Thank you, he whispered. Maybe we don't heal by forgetting. Maybe we heal by remembering, together. She nodded against his shoulder, her small arms tightening around his neck. Across the room, Eleanor turned away, wiping her eyes, a quiet smile breaking through the sorrow that had once ruled her life. As the sun dipped lower, the glass walls glowed amber, wrapping the room in warmth. Jordan set the drawing on the wall beside the sign that read Ethan's light. Beneath it, he wrote a single line, sometimes the brightest light comes from those once invisible. That evening, when the children had gone and the city outside shimmered in twilight, Jordan stood by the window, watching the lights flicker across the skyline. For a long time, he had believed his story ended in loss. Now he understood, it had only begun there. In the reflection on the glass, he could almost see Ethan's face, smiling, standing beside Isabel. And somewhere deep inside, he felt peace. The kind that doesn't erase pain but turns it into something new, something that glows quietly, like a star guiding others home. Sometimes the invisible ones hold the brightest light. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.